December 12, 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Somu Toyota sat in the dim briefing room, his weathered hands folded on the polished table before him. Around him, senior officers of the combined fleet shifted in their seats, their faces carved with the weight of 3 years of brutal naval warfare. The projector hummed in the corner, ready to display intelligence footage recently acquired through neutral channels. Outside, Tokyo bore the scars of American bombing raids, but inside this room, a different kind of devastation was about to unfold. What they were about to see would shatter every assumption they had held about American industrial capability. For years, Japanese Naval Command had monitored reports of American Liberty ships with a mixture of amusement and contempt. These vessels, they believed, represented everything wrong with American engineering philosophy. Mass production over craftsmanship, speed over quality, quantity attempting to compensate for inadequacy. Japanese shipyards built warships and cargo vessels with precision, with honor, with the dedication of artisans who understood that a ship was more than welded steel and riveted plates. It was a living extension of the empire's will, a testament to Japanese superiority in engineering and dedication. The Liberty ships seemed like jokes in comparison. Intelligence reports described them as simple, boxy freighters with no aesthetic grace, no engineering elegance, no attention to the details that separated adequate work from masterful construction. They were called ugly ducklings, even by Americans themselves. Japanese admirals had laughed at photographs showing these ungainly vessels, their straight lines and flat surfaces, lacking any of the curves and careful design that characterized proper shipbuilding. One officer had called them floating coffins, built by amateurs who learned their trade in automobile factories. Another suggested confidently that they would break apart in the first Pacific storm they encountered, proving that shortcuts in construction always led to catastrophic failures. But the laughter was becoming harder to sustain with each passing month, because these supposedly inferior vessels kept appearing, in convoys across the Atlantic carrying supplies to Britain, in supply lines to Australia, bringing equipment and reinforcements, in reinforcement operations throughout the Pacific theater supporting American advances. No matter how many Japanese submarines sank them, claiming tactical victories and celebrating successful torpedo attacks, more appeared. Always more. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of these crude freighters, and that persistence was beginning to trouble even the most confident commanders, who had initially dismissed them as negligible threats. Admiral Toyota had requested this briefing specifically. He needed to understand the source of this seemingly inexhaustible American merchant fleet. The footage had been obtained from a Swedish journalist who had toured American shipyards as part of a neutral press delegation, material that had made its way through complicated intelligence networks to Tokyo. What it showed would be analyzed, studied, debated, and ultimately used to understand the true nature of the enemy they faced. The lights dimmed, the projector clicked to life, and the admirals leaned forward, expecting confirmation of their assumptions about American industrial weakness. The first images showed a shipyard in California, Kaiser Permanente Metals Corporation's facility in Richmond. The scale alone was staggering, beyond anything they had anticipated. The yard stretched across acres of waterfront property, multiple slipways visible simultaneously, each one a hive of orchestrated activity that resembled a military operation more than traditional shipbuilding. Gantry cranes towered against the sky like steel giants, their cables and hooks moving with purposeful precision. Rail lines crisscrossed the facility, carrying prefabricated components from distant workshops to assembly points. Thousands of workers moved with coordinated purpose across every visible surface, their movements suggesting careful planning and systematic organization. But it was what happened next that made Admiral Toyota's breath catch in his throat. The footage was dated with precision. November 12, 1942, 0600 hours. It showed an empty slipway at the beginning of a morning shift. Just concrete, steel supports, and open space where a ship would eventually be constructed. The timestamp in the corner began counting forward, documenting every hour. What followed was not simply construction in any traditional sense. It was something else entirely. Something that defied every principle of shipbuilding the Japanese Navy understood and respected. Within the first 2 hours, the keel appeared. Not laid carefully over days with precise measurements and careful welding, but assembled in massive prefabricated sections, each one lowered by enormous cranes in a choreographed dance of industrial precision that suggested months of planning. Japanese shipyards built keels piece by piece, plate by plate, ensuring each weld met exacting standards established through generations of experience. This was different. This was assembly on a scale that seemed impossible, that violated fundamental assumptions about how ships were supposed to be built. The Admirals watched in growing silence as the Liberty ship called Robert E. Peary took shape before their eyes. The footage had been edited to compress time, showing hours of work in minutes of viewing, but the timestamps were clear, unaltered, verified through multiple independent intelligence sources. This was real. This was happening in American shipyards right now, at this very moment, while they sat in this briefing room watching shadows flicker on a screen. Prefabricated hull sections arrived on rail cars, each one already constructed in workshops miles away from the slipway. They were not building a ship from raw materials at the dock. They were assembling a ship from components manufactured simultaneously in different locations across the facility, then brought together in a final orchestrated construction process. It was the industrial equivalent of a perfectly executed military operation, timed and coordinated with frightening efficiency that left no room for traditional craftsmanship. Japanese officers began murmuring among themselves, their discomfort growing. One pointed at the screen, noting the extensive use of welding instead of riveting. Traditional Japanese ships used rivets, millions of them, each one requiring skilled labor and careful inspection to ensure structural integrity. The Americans were welding everything, using techniques that allowed less skilled workers to perform tasks that would have required years of apprenticeship and training in Japanese yards. It seemed crude, a shortcut that prioritized speed over quality. It seemed dangerous, the kind of compromise that would result in structural failures. It seemed like evidence of American inexperience and desperation, but it was undeniably, terrifyingly fast. The bulkheads rose section by section, each one positioned and secured in hours rather than days. The decks appeared in large prefabricated panels, lowered into place by cranes and welded to the growing structure with practiced efficiency. Superstructure sections, already built and fitted with equipment in separate workshops, were installed as complete units by massive cranes that moved with mechanical precision. Engine components, assembled and tested separately in climate-controlled workshops away from the weather and chaos of the shipyard, were brought to the slipway as functioning systems ready for installation and integration. Everything was modular. Everything was interchangeable. Everything was designed for rapid assembly by workers who might have been farmers, shopkeepers, or factory workers just months before, with minimal specialized training. The American approach treated shipbuilding not as a craft to be mastered over decades of dedicated study, but as a process to be standardized, documented in clear procedures, and executed by anyone who could follow instructions and work as part of a coordinated team. Admiral Toyota watched the timestamp tick forward relentlessly. 24 hours had passed in the footage. The Liberty ship now had a recognizable shape, its hull nearly complete, its basic structure standing where empty space had been just one day prior. In Japanese shipyards, this process took weeks of careful work, not because Japanese workers were slow or inefficient, but because the philosophy was fundamentally different. Every ship was an individual creation, crafted with care and attention, inspected at every stage by experienced supervisors, built to last decades in service to the Empire. But these Liberty ships were not being built to last decades. They were being built to last long enough to carry cargo across an ocean through submarine-infested waters, long enough to supply armies fighting on distant shores thousands of miles from home, long enough to replace the ones being sunk faster than Japan could possibly sink them with available submarine forces. The Americans had calculated exactly how long these vessels needed to survive to be useful, and they had engineered them to meet that requirement with nothing extra, nothing wasted, nothing that would slow production. The second day of footage showed systems installation proceeding at the same relentless, almost mechanical pace. Electrical wiring, already bundled and marked in color-coded schemes that any worker could follow, was run through the ship in hours rather than the days traditional methods required. Plumbing systems, prefabricated in sections with standardized connections that eliminated guesswork, fitted together like pieces of a puzzle, designed specifically for rapid assembly, without specialized expertise. The engine room, which would take Japanese shipwrights weeks to properly fit and align with the precision their rigorous training demanded, was operational in days because the engine had been assembled, tested under actual operating conditions, and installed as a complete functioning unit that required minimal adjustment. One officer broke the silence that had settled over the room, his voice tight with disbelief and growing concern. "They are treating a 10,000-ton ship like an automobile on an assembly line. This should not be possible." The intelligence analyst nodded, consulting his notes. "That is exactly correct, and it is intentional." Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who developed this particular system, came from construction and manufacturing backgrounds, not from traditional shipbuilding families or training. He applied automobile production techniques directly to ship construction. The traditionalists in American shipbuilding initially resisted his methods, calling them impossible, dangerous, and disrespectful to proper craftsmanship. But Kaiser proved them wrong by actually building ships faster than anyone thought possible. Japanese shipbuilding was an art form, a proud tradition passed from master to apprentice across generations, carrying the accumulated wisdom of centuries. This was something else entirely. This was industrial warfare translated directly into shipyard practice. This was mass production applied to vessels that weighed thousands of tons and carried the supplies that sustained global military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. This was a fundamental reimagining of what construction meant, what ships were, what production could achieve. By the third day of footage, the Liberty ship had smokestacks rising from its deck. It had lifeboats secured in their davits, ready for emergency use. It had navigation equipment being installed and calibrated on the bridge. Workers swarmed across every deck level like organized ants, each one following procedures so thoroughly standardized that individual skill mattered less than systematic execution of documented steps. The Admirals recognized what they were seeing, even if they had never witnessed it on this massive scale before. This was the American factory system, perfected in automobile plants and steel mills over decades, now applied to shipbuilding on a scale no nation had ever attempted or even imagined necessary. One officer asked quietly, his voice barely audible, "How many workers are required to achieve this speed of construction?" The intelligence analyst consulted his detailed notes, compiled from multiple sources. Peak shift reported approximately 4,000 workers on that single vessel, working around the clock in 3 carefully coordinated shifts. Each shift knows exactly what the previous shift accomplished, and exactly what the next shift must achieve to maintain schedule. The coordination is managed through detailed schedules, standardized procedures, and clear communication systems. 4,000 workers concentrated on one ship at peak construction intensity. Japanese shipyards might have 1,000 highly skilled craftsmen working across multiple vessels simultaneously, each craftsman applying expertise developed over years of dedicated training and experience. The Americans were concentrating massive labor forces on individual ships, overwhelming each construction challenge with sheer numbers and systematic organization, then moving those forces to the next slipway, the next vessel, in an endless cycle of production that never paused. But it was the final sequence of footage that truly silenced the room and crushed any remaining skepticism. November 16th, 1942, 2100 hours. 99 hours and 15 minutes after construction began. The Liberty ship, Robert E. Peary sat complete in the water, having been launched just hours before in a ceremony attended by local officials and press. Not complete in name only, but actually complete in every functional sense. Systems tested and operational, engines running smoothly, ready for cargo loading and immediate deployment. The vessel that had been empty space 4 days earlier was now a fully operational merchant ship capable of carrying 10,000 tons of supplies across any ocean in the world, through any weather, under any conditions. The projector clicked off. The lights came up slowly. No one spoke immediately. They were all performing the same mental calculations, running the same impossible mathematics, trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they understood about shipbuilding, industrial capacity, and strategic possibility. If Americans could build one Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of maximum capability, as a publicity stunt to prove their methods worked, how many could they build when working at normal, sustainable production speed? Intelligence reports suggested standard construction time was about 30 to 40 days per vessel, using these same prefabrication methods and systematic approaches. But with multiple slipways at each yard, with multiple shipyards using this system across the entire country, with prefabrication allowing parallel construction of components for dozens of ships simultaneously in different workshops. Admiral Toyota finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled, revealing nothing of the cold dread he felt settling in his chest. How many shipyards are currently using this prefabrication method to build Liberty ships? The analyst hesitated, double-checking his documentation to ensure accuracy, then answered. 18 shipyards across the United States are building Liberty ships using variations of the Kaiser prefabrication method. Richmond alone operates multiple slipways simultaneously with this system. Our latest intelligence estimates, cross-referenced from multiple independent sources including neutral observers and photographic reconnaissance, suggest they are collectively completing approximately 3 Liberty ships every single day across all facilities combined. 3 ships every day. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for Japanese strategic planning. Not 3 ships per month, which would be impressive. Not 3 ships per year, which would be respectable by any nation's standards. 3 ships every single day, 7 days per week, 52 weeks per year, indefinitely. The mathematics were devastating to contemplate. In 1 year, that production rate meant over 1,000 new merchant vessels added to the American fleet. In the time it took a Japanese shipyard to carefully craft one quality cargo ship using traditional methods and proper craftsmanship, the Americans could produce 30 Liberty ships using their industrialized approach. One officer, a veteran of the Dutch East Indies campaign who had witnessed Japanese naval superiority in the war's early months and expected it to continue, raised the question everyone was thinking, but hesitating to voice. What is their quality? Surely vessels built this quickly cannot withstand serious combat conditions or heavy seas. Surely they are structurally compromised by these shortcuts and time pressures. Surely they will fail under stress. The analyst pulled out another report. This one thicker, compiled from multiple sources over many months of observation and analysis. Initial Japanese assessments from 1942 suggested significant structural weakness in early Liberty ship designs. Several early vessels did experience hull cracking in cold North Atlantic waters during severe winter storms. The welded seams failed under extreme stress in ways that traditional riveted construction would not have. Some ships literally broke in half. However, American engineers systematically studied these failures, modified the basic design, added steel reinforcement at identified stress points, changed welding procedures and quality control measures based on actual failure data. Current intelligence from 1944 indicates the modified vessels are performing adequately for their intended purpose and expected lifespan. They are not beautiful works of naval architecture. They are not elegant expressions of engineering excellence. They will not last 30 years in service. But they float reliably, they carry cargo safely, and they survive long enough to be strategically useful, which is apparently all the Americans need them to do. Adequately. The word hung in the air like an indictment of everything the Japanese Navy valued and had built its reputation upon. These ships did not need to be masterpieces of naval architecture that would be studied by future generations. They did not need to showcase engineering excellence that brought honor to their creators. They needed to be sufficient for their immediate purpose, and sufficiency, when produced in overwhelming quantity that defied mathematical logic, was proving more strategically valuable than excellence produced in limited numbers, no matter how superior the individual quality. Another officer spoke up, his frustration and confusion evident in every word. We sink them. Our submarines sink them regularly in the Pacific and the Atlantic. Our crews are skilled and brave. How does this massive production matter strategically if we can destroy them faster than they can be useful? Admiral Toyota answered this himself, his voice heavy with the recognition of strategic reality that could not be wished away or overcome through courage alone. Because we cannot sink them faster than they can build them. If they produce 3 ships per day, we would need to sink more than 3 ships per day, every single day without exception, indefinitely into the future, just to maintain equilibrium and prevent their fleet from continuously growing. We are not achieving that rate of destruction. We have never achieved that rate, even in our most successful months. Given our current submarine production capacity and operational losses to American anti-submarine warfare, which improves constantly, we cannot possibly achieve that rate now or in the foreseeable future. The room fell silent again, as this reality settled over them like a suffocating weight that crushed hope. The strategic implications were catastrophic and irreversible. Every Liberty ship sunk by a Japanese submarine was a tactical victory celebrated by the crew, reported proudly in intelligence summaries, and used as evidence of continued Japanese naval effectiveness and warrior spirit. But it was also a strategic irrelevance, a meaningless achievement in the broader context. The Americans could replace losses faster than Japan could possibly inflict them. The industrial capacity being demonstrated was not just impressive by traditional standards, it was insurmountable through any military means available to Japan. One admiral, older than the others, a man who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier, when Japan first emerged as a modern naval power, spoke with the careful deliberation of someone who had seen Japan rise from regional power to empire. In our conflict with Russia in 1905, we won decisively because our ships were better built, better crewed, better commanded by superior officers. We defeated a numerically superior enemy through quality, discipline, superior training, and better doctrine. This worked because Russia could not replace their losses quickly enough, and their industrial capacity could not match their strategic ambitions or geographic challenges. But this situation, he gestured toward the now dark projection screen. This is fundamentally different. Quality cannot overcome this quantity. Discipline cannot overcome this industrial capacity. Superior training cannot compensate for this level of production. We are facing an enemy who has made adequacy into a decisive weapon by producing it faster than we can possibly destroy it. He was right, and everyone in that room knew it with sickening certainty. The Japanese Empire had built its entire naval strategy on the assumption that superior Japanese engineering, intensive training that created the world's best naval crews, and indomitable fighting spirit would compensate for smaller numbers and limited resources. It had worked brilliantly against Russia. It had worked in early Pacific campaigns when American forces were unprepared, under-equipped, and strategically surprised. But it was not working now, and it would never work against an enemy who could build ships in 4 days when pushed to maximum effort, and could sustain production of 3 ships per day indefinitely as normal operations. Admiral Toyota stood, walking slowly to the window overlooking Tokyo Bay, his movements deliberate and controlled. Japanese shipyards were visible in the distance through the winter haze, their cranes moving slowly, methodically, carefully, building warships and cargo vessels with the precise dedication that had always defined Japanese industrial practice and national character. Those yards were magnificent examples of traditional craftsmanship and engineering excellence. The workers were among the most skilled in the world, trained through rigorous apprenticeships. The ships they produced were excellent by any traditional measure of quality and durability, and none of that mattered anymore in this new form of industrial warfare, where quantity and speed had become more important than individual quality. They are not better shipbuilders than us, he said quietly, still looking out at the bay, speaking as much to himself as to the assembled officers. They are different shipbuilders operating under a completely different philosophy. They have industrialized the entire process in a way we never imagined necessary, desirable, or even possible. They have sacrificed artistry for efficiency, individual craftsmanship for systematic speed, long-term quality for immediate adequacy, and overwhelming output. And in doing so, they have created something we cannot match with our current methods, philosophy, and available resources. He turned back to face the assembled officers, his decision already made, his course clear despite its implications. This is not about ships anymore. This is about fundamentally different systems of production and industrial organization. The Americans have built a system that produces adequate ships faster than we can destroy them using all available military means. Our submarines are excellent vessels crewed by brave men. Our tactics are sound and proven in combat. But we are fighting a war of attrition against an enemy who has effectively removed attrition from the strategic equation through sheer productive capacity that exceeds anything we can counter. Another officer, younger, still unwilling to accept the full implications of what they had witnessed, argued back with the desperation of someone watching certainty collapse. But surely there are limits. Surely they cannot sustain this production indefinitely. Steel shortages must develop as resources are exhausted. Labor shortages must appear as men are drafted for military service. Resource constraints must eventually slow them down to manageable levels. The intelligence analyst shook his head slowly, consulting additional reports. Our intelligence suggests the opposite trend is occurring. American steel production has more than tripled since the war began and continues to increase. They have trained millions of new workers, including women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war and were not considered part of the industrial workforce. They have converted automobile factories, appliance manufacturers, and civilian industries to war production at scales we did not anticipate. The Liberty Ship program is not straining their economy to the breaking point. It is just one part of a larger industrial mobilization that includes aircraft, armor, weapons, and supplies across every category. Just one part. The Liberty ships, as overwhelming as their production was, represented only a fraction of total American industrial output. They were simultaneously building destroyers, escort carriers, fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, aircraft numbering in the tens of thousands, tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, and supplies on similar massive scales across hundreds of facilities. The entire American economy had been reorganized into a machine designed for overwhelming productive output across every category of military equipment necessary for global warfare. One admiral raised the question that terrified him most, that kept him awake at night. If they can build a complete ship in 4 days and 15 hours when they want to prove a point and demonstrate maximum capability to the world, what else can they build at similar speeds? How many aircraft can they produce per month? How many tanks? How many of everything? No one answered immediately because the intelligence reports already told that story in numbing detail that was difficult to fully comprehend. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that exceeded total Japanese annual production in just months. Tank production followed similar overwhelming patterns. Artillery, vehicles, weapons of every type flowed from American factories in numbers that seemed impossible, but were verified through multiple intelligence sources. The production gap was not narrowing as the war continued, and Japanese industry strained to increase output. It was widening with every passing month, with every new factory that came online, with every improvement in American production methods and worker training. Admiral Toyota returned to his seat, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts or the implications he understood. This briefing and all supporting documentation will be shared with Imperial General Headquarters immediately. Fleet commanders at all levels need to understand what we are facing with complete clarity. Our strategy must account for American productive capacity as the primary determining factor in this war, not a secondary concern to be addressed after tactical considerations. We are not fighting the American Navy of 1941 anymore. We are fighting an industrial power that is fully mobilized in ways we did not think possible, necessary, or sustainable. He paused, looking at each officer in turn, ensuring they understood the gravity of what he was about to say. Those Liberty ships we mocked and laughed at? Those ugly, simple, crude freighters we thought would sink in the first Pacific storm and prove American industrial inadequacy. They are winning the war against us, not through individual excellence or superior design, but through collective sufficiency produced in overwhelming numbers that cannot be countered. They are carrying the fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, weapons, replacement parts, and equipment that keeps American forces supplied everywhere simultaneously across the entire Pacific and Atlantic. They are the logistical backbone of a global military operation we cannot meaningfully disrupt, because we cannot sink them fast enough to create strategic impact. The meeting concluded with formal orders to update strategic assessments, to revise submarine targeting priorities based on realistic expectations, to consider the implications for long-term planning and resource allocation in light of American industrial superiority. But everyone in that room understood the fundamental truth that had been revealed by 99 hours of footage showing a ship built from empty space. Japan had prepared to fight a war against the American Navy, expecting to defeat ships with superior ships and crews with superior crews. Instead, they were fighting a war against American industry, against a system of production that operated on principles they had not adequately understood or prepared to counter. And American industry was winning through methods that traditional military thinking had never adequately considered as decisive factors in warfare. In the weeks and months that followed, additional intelligence arrived from various sources. Photographs of other American shipyards showed similar scenes of systematic mass production. The prefabrication method was not unique to Kaiser's Richmond facility. It was being replicated and adapted across the country with variations suited to local conditions, available resources, and specific facility capabilities. The 4-day Liberty ship had been a publicity achievement, a demonstration of what was possible when an entire organization pushed to absolute limits with unlimited resources. But the real achievement, the strategically decisive achievement, was the sustainable production of 3 ships per day, every day, month after month, with no signs of slowing or resource exhaustion. Japanese naval officers who had laughed at those first photographs of Liberty ships in 1942 no longer laughed in 1944. They recognized them now for what they truly were. Not individual vessels to be judged on aesthetic qualities or traditional engineering criteria, but units of industrial output in a production system designed for overwhelming quantity over individual quality. Each Liberty ship was a data point in a production curve that favored the Americans more with each passing day, each passing month, each passing year of continued warfare. The strategic debates that followed were painful, contentious, and ultimately futile exercises in exploring options that did not exist. Some officers argued for focusing submarine resources exclusively on sinking Liberty ships to disrupt American supply lines and force them to divert production capacity. Others pointed out the mathematical futility of trying to sink 3 ships per day, when Japanese submarine production could not keep pace with operational losses, and American anti-submarine warfare was becoming increasingly effective with new technologies and tactics. Some suggested targeting the shipyards themselves through long-range air raids that would destroy production facilities, but American air defenses and the vast distances involved made such operations impractical with available resources and aircraft ranges. The truth, unspoken in formal meetings but understood by everyone involved in these discussions, was that there was no good answer to this problem. The Americans had created an industrial advantage so profound, so overwhelming, that military excellence could not overcome it through any conventional means available to Japan. Japanese ships were still better designed by traditional standards of naval architecture. Japanese crews were still superbly trained in tactics, gunnery, and seamanship. Japanese naval doctrine was still fundamentally sound based on decades of study and experience. But none of that could compensate for an enemy who could absorb losses and replace them faster than they could be inflicted by available forces. Admiral Toyota received regular updates on Liberty ship sightings throughout the Pacific Theater from various intelligence sources. Each report was another reminder of the industrial reality they faced and could not change. The ships carried tanks to Australia, supporting Allied buildups, aircraft to India, enabling bomber operations, supplies to China, sustaining resistance, fuel to advanced bases across the Pacific, enabling American fleet operations. They were everywhere, always, in numbers that made individual destruction strategically meaningless. Sinking one Liberty ship accomplished nothing when 2 more were completed that same day in American shipyards thousands of miles away. He thought often of that footage in quiet moments. The empty slipway on November 12th at dawn, just concrete and steel supports. The completed ship in the water on November 16th at dusk, fully functional and ready for service. 4 days and 15 hours from nothing to operational vessel carrying 10,000 tons. In that same period, Japanese shipyards working with traditional methods and proper craftsmanship might have completed preliminary planning documents and material ordering for a new vessel. The contrast was not just numerical or technical, it was philosophical, representing 2 entirely different approaches to industrial warfare, and one approach was proving decisively superior in actual strategic practice. The Liberty ships continued to sail across every ocean carrying the war to Japan. They carried the weight of American logistics, supplied every theater of operation, sustained every offensive, enabled every advance across the Pacific. They were ugly by aesthetic standards that valued graceful lines. They were simple by engineering standards that valued sophisticated solutions. They were crude by craftsmanship standards that valued individual excellence. And they were exactly what the Americans needed them to be for strategic victory. Sufficient for purpose, numerous beyond counting or effective interdiction, unstoppable through any military means available to Japan with current or foreseeable resources. Japanese admirals no longer laughed at Liberty ships in late 1944. They had learned the hardest lesson of industrial warfare, learned it too late to change their strategic position or alter the war's ultimate trajectory. In a prolonged conflict where production capacity determines ultimate outcomes more than tactical brilliance, the side that can build adequate solutions faster will defeat the side that builds perfect solutions slower every single time. The Americans had embraced adequacy and speed over perfection in traditional craftsmanship. They had industrialized shipbuilding to a degree that made traditional approaches strategically irrelevant to final victory, and in doing so, they had demonstrated a form of national power that could not be sunk by torpedoes, destroyed in surface battles, or overcome through tactical brilliance and warrior spirit. They had demonstrated the power of systematic, overwhelming, relentless productive capacity, applied with ruthless efficiency, the power to build faster than the enemy could destroy, the power to replace losses before they created strategic vulnerabilities or forced operational changes. The power to supply global military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously without pause, limitation, or significant strain on the overall civilian economy. The Liberty ships were more than cargo vessels or logistical assets. They were proof that American industrial strength was the true decisive weapon of the war, more important than any battleship or aircraft carrier. And that realization, more than any naval defeat at Midway, the Philippines, or elsewhere, convinced those Japanese admirals that they were facing an enemy whose greatest weapon was not on the battlefield at all. It was in the shipyards, the factories, the steel mills, and the organizational systems that allowed a nation to build a ship in 4 days as a demonstration of maximum capability, and 3 ships every day as standard sustainable practice, for years on end without faltering or exhausting resources. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from World War II. Share your thoughts in the comments about the incredible industrial achievement of the Liberty ships and what they represented in the broader context of the war.